Good morning, Byron Eagles. I hope that everybody is doing well and staying safe. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about the 1920s, the Jazz Age. Beginning in the 1920s, we'll talk a little bit about clashes between traditional and modern values that'll shake up the United States. We'll talk about the rise in racism, nativism, the idea that you should be a natural-born citizen, and how that will lead to immigration quotas and restrictions. We'll also describe a clash of values in the 1920s as far as changing the status of women moving more toward the forefront, trying to be as far as equality, getting involved in the workforce, and changing their appearance, bobbing their hair, drinking prohibited liquor, becoming a flapper, trying to become more independent. As far as nativism and the clash of values, as the 1920s opened, there will be an economic recession. We have an influx of immigrants in the United States, leading to racial and cultural tensions, combining to create an atmosphere of disillusionment and intolerance. And with that comes fear and prejudice. So on April 15, 1920, after two men were shot and killed, two employees of the Slater and Morrill Shoe Company in South Braintree, Massachusetts, will be arrested. A man by the name of Nicola Sacco, who was a shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a fish peddler. Now, the two were Italian immigrants who were also well-known anarchists or people who didn't believe in forms of government and the institution of government. And again, they will be arrested for murder. And although no one at the time knew if Sacco and Vanzetti were actually guilty, many people leaped to the conclusion because these two men were Italian immigrants and, of course, anarchists. So guilt was presumed simply because of their immigration status and the fact that they were anarchists or against government. Unfortunately, the two men, the Italian immigrants and anarchists, will be found guilty and sentenced to death on July 14th, 1921. Nativist, racist feelings in the 1920s enforced or reinforced by the belief of the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was a pseudoscience or a false science dealing with things like improving hereditary traits. Eugenics fueled the nativist argument for superiority of the original American stock, the white Protestant of Northern European descent. Political, intellectual, cultural figures, even Woodrow Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge, will embrace this idea of eugenics, this pseudoscience, and by doing so, they lent authority to racist theories, reinvigorated the nativist argument for strict immigration and control of immigrants. At the forefront of the movement to restrict immigration was the return of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. The odd KKK had flourished in the South after the Civil War and used threats of violence to intimidate newly freed African Americans. And now this new Klan was not only targeting African Americans, but Catholics and Jews, founded by a former Methodist preacher himself, William J. Simmons. And again, this was all a pledge to hopefully preserve the American white race. Emergency Quota Act, 1921, President Harding will sign the Emergency Quota Act, which established a temporary quota system limiting immigration from certain parts of the world. According to this act, only 3% of the total number of foreign-born people of a nationality already living in the United States, as indicated off the 1910 census, could be admitted in a single year. So this theoretically restricted the number of immigrants from other countries, but in practice it discriminated heavily against people from parts of Eastern or Southern Europe. ethnic identity and national origin thus determined your admission into the United States under the Emergency Quota Act in 1920. New morality. Many groups that wanted to restrict immigration also wanted to preserve what they considered to be traditional values. They feared that there was a new morality taking over the nation, challenging traditional ways of seeing and thinking. The new morality glorified youth, personal freedom, influenced various aspects of American society. Like in the 1920s, women beginning to bob their hair, cut it short, wearing flesh-colored silk stockings, revealing attire, smoking cigarettes, drinking prohibited liquor. These flappers, these young, dramatic, and stylish women, changing their personal satisfaction in the way they appeared and changing the morality. While many Americans were embracing that new morality, millions more were fearing that the country was losing its traditional values. To these Americans, the modern consumer culture, relaxed ethics, and growing urbanism symbolizing the national's moral decline. Many of these people, especially those in small rural towns, responded by joining a religious movement known as fundamentalism. A name derived from a series of pamphlets titled The Fundamentals, published by oil millionaire Lyman Stewart. The fundamentalist believed that the Bible was literally true and without error. They defended the Protestant faith against ideas of implying that human beings derived their moral behavior from society and nature, not God. In particular, fundamentalists rejected Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, which said that, of course, human beings developed from lower forms of life over the course of millions of years. Instead, the fundamentalists believed in creationism, the belief that God created the world as described in the Bible. And here we have two popular evangelical preachers, Billy Sunday, Amy McPherson, kind of steering up the fundamentalist passions, going around speaking to large crowds. A former professional baseball player, Sunday, drew huge crowds, rapid-fire sermons on stage. McPherson, she was more conducting her revivals and faith healings in parts of California like Los Angeles. She was more flamboyant, more theatrical, using stage. She would actually dress in costume, both of them expressing their themes of highly emotional sermons and their beliefs and their moral values and their fundamentalist beliefs. Going back to evolution versus creationism, we also have a historic landmark case or a trial in 1925 dealing with the Tennessee Butler Act, which outlawed any teaching other than the story of the divine creation of man as taught by the Bible. In this case, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, will hire a man by the name of John T. Scopes, who was a high school biology teacher in Dayton, Tennessee. He will teach evolution in a classroom and be arrested and put on trial, what is known as the Scopes trial or the monkey trial. The trial took place in the summer of 1925. William Jennings Bryan, a three-time Democratic presidential candidate, former candidate for president, will be the prosecutor, and he will represent the creationist. Clarence Dowell, one of the country's more celebrated trial lawyers, will defend Scopes. Darrow, after 8 days of trial, unfortunately will lose in his case and his efforts, and Scopes will be found guilty and judged a fine of $100. Now, although the conviction is going to be later overturned based on a technicality, the Scopes trial, parts of the trial, will be broadcast over the radio and increasingly fundamentalists will find themselves isolated from mainstream Protestantism, and their commitment to political activism will begin to decline. The movement to ban alcohol had begun building kind of throughout the late 1800s. Now, by the early 1900s, many progressives and traditionalists supported prohibition, the manufacture, making it illegal to manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol. Many people believe that prohibition of alcohol would help reduce things like unemployment, domestic violence, poverty, crime. Their support helped pass the 18th Amendment, a ratification to the Constitution, amendment to the Constitution, which will take effect in January of 1920. In an effort to enforce the amendment, Congress passed the National Prohibition Act, which will also be known as the Volstead Act. Enforcing prohibition now became the responsibility of the U.S. Treasury Department. While Treasury agents had enforced federal tax laws for many years, they now had the police powers, or the government's power to control people and property in the interest of the public safety, health, welfare, and morals. The 18th Amendment granted federal and state governments the power to enforce this prohibition, marking a dramatic increase in federal police powers, or power of the federal government. The Treasury Department new prohibition unit will struggle to enforce it. During the 1920s, we'll actually see a rise in crime. There'll be some 540,000 arrests, but most Americans will not be deterred and will persist in blatantly basically ignoring the law. People will begin to flock to their secret bars known as speakeasies, where they could purchase illegal alcohol. In New York City alone, there was an estimated 32,000 such speakeasies or secret bars that were selling liquor illegally. Organized crime begins to specialize in supplying and often running these speakeasies, popping up all over the country. Huge profits that could be made supplying liquor encourage some people to become smugglers, bringing liquor into the United States from parts of the other world like Canada and the Caribbean. Smuggling and consumption of liquor by millions helped create an illegal billion-dollar industry for gangsters. More than 70 federal agents were killed while enforcing prohibition in the 1920s. And again, crime became sort of a big business. Some gangsters, like the one pictured here, Al Capone, actually had enough money to corrupt even some of the local politicians, paying off the police officers, the judges, putting them on their payroll. Capone dominated organized crimes in Chicago, where he ran bootlegging and other criminal rackets. Eventually, Capone will be caught and arrested and tried for tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. But the battle to repeal prohibition began almost as soon as the 18th Amendment was ratified. Supporters of repeal believed prohibition was excessive, prudish, and again, you could see that crime was more on a rise. It didn't help to prevent it. It actually created a new form of crime, organized crime. So with that, the ratification of the 21st Amendment, 1933, will repeal the 18th Amendment and officially bring prohibition, federally mandated prohibition, to an end. And again, this will be the first time in American history where you have an amendment to an amendment, the 21st repealing the 18th. Cultural innovations as far as the African Americans, some of the art explosions, things that will take place in the 1920s. Going back to modern art or modern American art, we will have bohemian or unconventional artistic movements that will be taking place. This will also impact or affect sports, movies, mass media, radio, pop culture, even the rise of Hollywood. Many modern American artists or European art movements will greatly influence the modernist of American art during the 1920s. Perhaps most striking was the diverse range of artistic styles, each sort of attempting to express the individual modern experience. We had poets and writers like Carl Sandburg, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who many I'm sure you're probably familiar with, The Great Gatsby, exposing kind of the emptiness or the superficiality of modern society. We had baseball greats or famous heroes like Babe Ruth, the Sultan of Swat, the Great Bambino, popular for hitting hundreds of home runs there in the 1920s. We also had heavyweight champs, Jack Dempsey, college football greats like Red Grange out of the University of Illinois, Gertrude Ederle, the first woman to swim the English Channel in a record 14 hours. But going back to Hollywood, nothing matched the allure of the motion picture. Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino. Also 1927, we have the first talking picture, or the first Hollywood picture with sound, with audio. The Jazz Singer, which will be produced again in 1927. Popular radio shows. On the radio, we had music, but we also had commercials. And if you go to the call letters KDKA out of Pittsburgh, we learned that there was a landslide victory for Warren G. Harding. He had won the presidential election, and that was first learned through the news of the KDKA, or to the KDKA listeners out of Pittsburgh. Mass media, radio, newspapers, magazines, also impacting pop culture during the 1920s. African Americans, again, moving toward the forefront after the Great Migration and the move north. We have a rebirth that'll take place in Harlem, New York, known as the Harlem Renaissance. What happened was, after World War I, hundreds of thousands of African Americans joined in this move north from the rural South. The Great Migration, moving north, African Americans sought to escape the segregated society of the South to find things like economic opportunities, to better build lives for themselves or their families. And with that, after World War I, the Black popularity and populations began to swell in some of the larger northern cities like Harlem, which will result in the flowering of African American arts and become known as the Harlem Renaissance, or the rebirth of Harlem. Environment stimulating, again, as I stated, artistic development, racial pride, community, and political organization, flowing of African American arts in the Harlem Renaissance. One of the most prolific, original, and versatile writers of the Harlem Renaissance was a man by the name of Langston Hughes. Born in Joplin, Missouri, Hughes became a leading voice of the African American experience in the U.S. during the 1920s. Jazz, blues, and theater. Shortly after, Louis Armstrong, who was a jazz musician, arrived in Chicago from New Orleans. He will introduce improvisational early forms of jazz, which was a style of music kind of influenced by Dixieland music and ragtime. And in 1925, 3 years after joining Joe King Oliver's band, Armstrong awed fellow musicians with a series of recordings made with his group, the Hot Five. Ragtime also influenced the composers, the pianists, the band leaders, people like Duke Ellington, who listened as a teenager to ragtime piano in Washington, D.C. And in 1923, Ellington formed a small band, moving to New York, and began playing at some of the secret bars, some of the speakeasies. Like many other African Americans, though, and tenors like Ellington got his start at the Cotton Club, one of the most famous Harlem night spots, and years later reflected on the music of his era, quoted as saying, "Everything, and I repeat, everything had to swing." And that was just it. Those cats really had it. They had that soul. And you can't just play some of the music without soul. Soul is very important. The racial pride, also sparking the artistic achievements of the Harlem Renaissance, fueled the political and economic aspirations of many African Americans. The post-war years saw the development of new attitudes among African Americans who forged new roles in life and in politics. For many, the sight of the 1,300 African American men of the 15th Regiment of the New York's National Guard returning from the war and marching through Manhattan and home to Harlem symbolized these aspirations, many of them hoping to gain the right to vote. At election times, most African American voters in the North cast their votes for Republicans, who happened to be the party of Abraham Lincoln. And in 1928, African American voters in Chicago achieved a significant political breakthrough. Voting as a group, they helped to elect Oscar DePriest, who was the first African American representative in Congress from a northern state. During his 3 terms in Congress, DePriest did introduce laws to provide pensions to formerly enslaved African Americans. In over 75 years, he was able to declare Lincoln's birthday a public holiday and to find and imprison officials who allowed lynchings of prisoners. However, one of the greatest accomplishments of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was the defeat of racist Judge John J. Parker, who was being nominated to the Supreme Court. A dynamic black leader from Jamaica, a man by the name of Marcus Garvey, captured the imagination of millions of African Americans with his call for Negro nationalism, which glorified the black culture and traditions of the past. Inspired by Booker T. Washington's call for self-reliance, Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, an organization aimed at promoting black pride and unity. The central message of Garvey's Harlem-based movement was that African Americans could gain economic and political power by educating themselves. Garvey also advocated separation and independence from whites. With that, Garvey's sort of failure to keep his movement alive inspired millions of African Americans with a sense of pride in their heritage and hope for future. That sense of pride and hope survived long after Garvey and his Back to Africa movement was gone. The idea was that many of the African Americans would move back to the motherland, back to Africa, and settle in countries like Liberia. Again, the 1920s, an era of cultural innovation, a clash of values, a rise of African American culture. All of these things impacting the Jazz Age or the Roaring 20s, 1921 to 1929.